Um, I want to address a, I guess, an idea or a theory that has basically floated around the, I guess, Crossfire Injection community for decades, literally decades, probably 30 years at least. Did General Motors intentionally, quote, sabotage the Crossfire Injection engine? The answer to that is no. There's talk that they intentionally choked the Crossfire Injection engine down in anticipation of the release of the tune port injection setup in 1985 in the F bodies and the Corvettes. The Crossfire Injection engine, or induction system rather, began development in the mid 70s. In an era where, and I've said this before, I wasn't around back then, but just looking at the technology that was around back then, HEI had just come out as standard equipment on cars and trucks in 1975 for GM. Chrysler electronic ignition came out a few years before that. I'm not sure about Ford and their DuraSpark stuff, but as far as General Motors goes, that was the first, to the best of my knowledge, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but it was the first mass-produced electronic fuel injection system for General Motors. I mean, you had the Rochester mechanical fuel injection, way back late 50s, early 60s, stuff like that. But the late 70s, early 80s cars were not, and still aren't, known for high quality, reliability, good panel fit, good interior quality, you name it. There's a lot of really, really good looking cars that were made back then in that era. There's a lot of cars back then that look good. The Camaros, the Trans Ams. I'm not at all a fan of the C3 Corvette after the steel bumpers went away, the front and rear steel bumpers, and 72 was the last year. I don't like any C3 Corvettes after that. No offense to any of the C3 owners or anything, but it's known as the smog era and the malaise era for a reason. The cars said, there wasn't anything that had more than 8-to-1, 8.5-to-1 compression. The cams were broomsticks in comparison to what they were 15 years before that, at the height of the muscle car era. And that being said, it began development in the mid to late 70s is when they really started working towards increased fuel economy, increased reliability, lower emissions, this and that. They had the 73 oil embargo. They had another one in the late 70s, I think like 78 or something like that. Chrysler almost went belly up. I'm not sure. I'm sure GM wasn't doing that well, back in that era either. I don't know where this sabotage idea came from. Like I said, they pretty much worked with what they had technology-wise. And I've brought this up. Anybody that's ever had the intake manifold off of a Crossfire injection motor knows that the ports or the runners neck down to roughly 2/3 of the size of any standard small block Chevy engine ever made, from 265 all the way up to a 400. They're choked down, and for some reason or another, people think that at the time the largest and most profitable auto manufacturer in the world, General Motors, would intentionally, in an era where they're trying to squeeze every last horsepower and mile per gallon out of these cars, for somebody to think that they would intentionally choke down an engine in anticipation of the release of a more modern port fuel injection, i.e. the tune port motors in 85, is completely ridiculous. The reason that they designed the manifold the way they did, I mean, there's a General Motors engineer that worked on the Corvettes and in the the GM powertrain department in the 70s and into the 80s, by the name of Hib Halverson, and he was one of the engineers working on the development of this throttle body fuel injection system. And the manifold, I guess, was kind of a throwback to the the original cross ram manifold on the 302s on the late 60s Camaros. That being said, it was designed, with obviously with what I would call nostalgia in mind, maybe, but it was designed to fit under lower hoods. The Camaro, Firebird, and Corvette all had very, very low hoods. They were looking at a throttle body fuel injection system that would work in a performance application and would be able to fit under the stock hood of the car. So I guess according to everything I've read and heard, they originally were looking at like an inline multi-throttle body system, which created hood clearance issues. Somebody came up with the idea, hey, we ran a cross ram back in the late 60s on these 302s, let's develop one for the upcoming F-body and Corvette. So that's what they did. This engineer stated that the reason that the runners of the intake manifold, you have to understand the operation of a Crossfire injection system. I'm sure there's people that don't know, but the reason it's called Crossfire is your driver's side throttle body feeds the passenger side bank of the engine. The passenger side throttle body feeds the driver's bank of the engine, the driver's side bank. So you have very, very long runners by design. There's no way around it. What they found was, with the initial design, they had standard, the original runners and original port, the exits out of the manifold were much larger, probably, if I was to guess, along the size of a standard small block Chevy. And the problem that they ran into, according to this engineer who worked on the development of this intake and this fuel injection system, was the engine made great top end power for what it was and in the era that it was in. But they had a problem with off-idle tip-in and part throttle drivability due to the fact that these runners were so long and so large, volume-wise and cross-section wise and everything, that they had issues with fuel basically puddling in the intake manifold, in the floor of the base of the intake manifold. So their solution to that, and I guess they had they had horrible gas mileage, horrible emissions and everything before this was corrected. But it made great top end power. Their solution to that was to taper down the overall size of the intake runners in order to increase port velocity, to eliminate that fuel puddling, and basically maintain that atomization of the fuel throughout the entire length of the runner. There was, I guess, I've heard and read here and there that back in the day there was talk, at the height of all these gas shortages and emissions crunches and ever tightening emissions regulations. There was talk that the 350 was going to go away. I mean, I know and I'm not sure if people are aware of this, but all Corvettes sold in the 1980 model year were equipped with a 305. You couldn't get a 350 in California, big surprise. So I guess the idea was, and this went all the way to the development and production of the tune port injection manifold. You drive a tune port 305, and even the later LB9s, the G92 cars, the N10 cars, they're low 14-second cars all day long with a 305, and they'll pull to 5,000, 5,200 RPMs. You put that same, manifold, i.e. an L98, an 87 to a 92 L98, or 85 to 91 in a Corvette, and they will not whine. It's like they just lay down right above, say 46, 4,700 RPMs, because that manifold was designed for a 305. The 350 obviously ended up sticking around. Performance started picking up as the 80s went on and into the early 90s. They never redesigned the manifold because, why fix what's not broken? But as far as General Motors intentionally sabotaging the Crossfire injection engine to produce less power, knowing that the tune port injection system would be introduced. I mean, they were having enough problems as it was with California emissions regulations in 1984. The C4 was originally set to be released in 1983, but because they couldn't pass California emission standards, because they didn't have the technology and the know-how, they had to delay the release of the car. So do you really think for a half a second that a company like General Motors is going to intentionally, quote, sabotage? I mean, it's all over the internet. It has been, and before the internet was around, it was, that was what people, anytime this manifold ever came up and this injection system ever came up, that was people's thought process. I mean, this interview with this General Motors former General Motors engineer can be found online all over the place. These things were made in an era where, like I said, and I've talked to people that were mechanics back in the day, that were old enough to be able to work on cars back in the day, whether it was at a shop, a dealership, or just a hobbyist. I've heard stories over and over and over again when, people would have problems with a car, with a GM car, and the first thing they would look at was the HEI. Oh, it's got to be the HEI, all this electronics crap, and they would pull it out and put a points distributor in it because they didn't understand it. It's the same reason that, the Crossfire injection system was bad-mouthed and still is to this day. People didn't understand it. There's a procedure for everything, all the way down to idle speed and ignition timing setting. The same thing people, they bad-mouth the tune ports, and they always have. I mean, I remember when I was a teenager, people would badmouth the tune ports. Oh, they're gutless, they're this, they're that, they're truck motors, all they are is torque, and well, I mean, back in 1990, an L98, IROC, Trans Am, anything like that, I mean, they were low 14-second cars all day long, and they were getting 25 miles per gallon on the highway. The 85 Corvette with the tune port was rated at only 25 more horsepower than the 84 Crossfire Corvette. So like I said, they did what they could do with what they had at the time when, they were worried more about fuel economy and staying afloat than they were, they're sabotaging something that wasn't, in anticipation of something that was going to be released 4 or 5 years down the road. And anybody that thinks otherwise, and anybody that believes that it was intentionally done, I don't know what to tell you. I guess look into it more. You know what I mean? The design of the manifold itself is decent, I guess, for for the limited number of them that they made, in comparison to your standard quadrajet intake manifold. Does the manifold as it was cast need need some improvements, need some work? Of course it does. Anything does. I mean, you can go buy a brand new Performer RPM, and you can grind on it and make it run better than it did out of the box. But like I said, I think anybody that believes this sabotage theory, you really owe it to yourself to do a little bit more research, because of all companies, the largest auto manufacturer in the world at the time, I really have my doubts that they would intentionally, quote, sabotage something that they had millions and millions of dollars and years of research and development into. So let's choke it down, even though we have no idea how this new port fuel injection system 5 years down the road is going to run. Let's do what we can to kill this thing, to make this extra 25 horsepower out of this, this Corvette that'll be out in 85, make it look that much better. I don't think so. It can be found online. Like I said, the former engineer's name is Hib Halverson. There's other interviews, related to this and everything, but I recommend everybody does their research and looks into it, because it's actually pretty interesting with reading about what they were faced with at the time, in an effort to combat these emissions requirements and fuel economy requirements and stuff like that. Because like I said, everybody was looking for every last horsepower they can get out of a car. You're going to look at a brand new Corvette. Why would you choke it down? And for the record, the 82 Corvette was rated at more horsepower, at a higher horsepower than any other Corvette before that, until back to like 1974. So in that 8-year span, the 82 Corvette with Crossfire Injection made more power. But like I said, I just wanted to get on here and let everybody know that this was quoted by a former General Motors engineer who had his hands in the development, the research, and the production of this fuel injection system. Is it the greatest one on the face of the earth? Absolutely not. Even by 90 standards, the thing is, it's a piece of crap. But it's nostalgic. It's unknown to most people. Most people don't even know what the hell it is when they see it. And like I said, the ones that are still out there, people don't even know what to do with them. But like I said, I just want to get on here and fill everybody in on that, and do some research on it. But it was not intentionally sabotaged. So I'll be back with more videos soon.